Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 16, Moving Through Phases of Training. Hey guys, welcome back to the Dog Trainers Podcast. This is episode 16, Moving Through Phases of Training. Before we dive in, we just want to thank you guys so much. I feel like I talk about it every time now, but this podcast has just been growing at such a crazy extent. I mean, we've had over 300 downloads in like the past 30 days, which to something as new as this, and we've never done a podcast before, this is just crazy to us. I'm looking through the analytics here, and we have people from Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, and Australia. And we just want to thank you guys so much. And we're going to continue to do the very best job that we can to bring you guys great content. You can find Brent and I on Instagram. You can find me at Untamed Dog Co. That's Untamed Dog Co. All one word. Brent is at Canis Behavior, Canis Behavior, all one word. So I'm going to kick it over to Brent. I think what we'll do is give a quick overview of some phases of training, and then we'll dive into them in a little more detail, and we'll see what we can do. Over to you, man.
What's up, everybody? It's Brent. We're back for episode 16. We're really excited about this episode because for many, many years, this one really hits home for me because for many, many years, I've actually taught people how to be dog trainers and worked with them. Actually, me and Mariano have actually taught several people, assistants who now are dog trainers professionally, to learn the art of dog training, right? And as it goes with any art, there's different component pieces that you have to learn. But the artistry of it all is learning when to do what, learning when to move forward, developing a style. But there are definitely some fundamentals and some or not fundamentals, but there are some key core concepts that we see in training that repeat themselves over and over. So we want to talk about those today when we're talking about moving through phases of training. But I think one thing that's going to be really helpful for not just people who are dog enthusiasts who are listening, but definitely people who are young dog trainers who may be a little unsure as to when we are supposed to move from one phase of training to another phase of training. Hopefully this shines some light on that, a little bit of that confusion. I know I've trained many dog trainers and had assistants who may not knew when it was the right time to throw in a certain technique, or they don't know when it's sometimes they're a little too shy to put certain pressure on dogs who needed certain amounts of pressure. Right. So we're going to talk about those things. We're going to give you guys our tips and our experiential experience of when to do these things. So let's go.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to give a quick, it is funny when if anybody listening has been, or I guess if you're a dog trainer, at some point you were an assistant learning how to do this stuff, or if you are training assistants yourself, it's funny that we're talking about people when we had our assistants in LA who they knew what they were doing. They knew phase 1 stuff and they knew phase 2 stuff, but they didn't quite know when it was okay to move from phase 1 to phase 2. And they didn't quite know all the time what exactly that looked like, because of course, on paper, it's easy to simplify these things, but dog to dog in a kennel, sometimes this one is a little different, and they have their own little quirks and things. And so you have to be able to kind of read the terrain. And it is that fun kind of in between of like, here's the blueprint, here's what I'm going to teach this dog because this is what the client needs from us, but also allowing for the dog's individuality and how we go about playing with that. So I'm just going to break down the 3 phases really quick, and then we'll dive into them in some more detail.
Right. And mind you, there could also be more phases than this, depending on what profession or what style of work or obedience you're doing. But these are just a general 3 phases that we see commonly occur in dog training.
Yeah, definitely. That is that's an important thing to point out. We're talking like the average pet dog obedience here.
Yes.
Right. So here we go. Phase 1, shaping. Phase 2, conditioning, and phase 3, finishing work. So let's dive into phase 1 with shaping, because I know that you have a lot to say when it comes to luring.
Yeah, no, definitely luring is a huge one. I kind of look at the shaping process as teaching the component pieces of behavior that we want, right? So I've given this story before in the past, but those of you who are just checking in, I remember being a little kid, and when I was a little kid, my mom would, in essence, have me help her with the dishes, right? I'd be 3 or 4 years old. She'd sit me up on the counter, and my job was to dry the dishes, right? Or when I got a little older or taller, I'd get the stepping stool and I'd put the dishes away in the cabinet. That was my way of helping my mom and spending time with her. And I remember over several years, my mom would teach me the component pieces of the behavior that would be washing dishes, right? So Over time, we start saying that I learned all these component pieces and I was able to create a behavior, right? She was able to shape this behavior where I knew how to soap a dish, I knew how to rinse a dish, I knew how to dry a dish, and I knew how to put that dish away, right? So this was ultimately the behavior sequence she was trying to do. Through my childhood, however, we did a lot of conditioning. And in my adulthood, we will say that we did some finishing work, right? So we'll get into those comparisons a little bit later. But to go back to the point we were talking about, we're talking about luring. So luring has a couple different aspects to it. I think if you have like a really driven dog, something like luring with food is really really easy, right? If I have a dog who's highly food motivated, pretty much it's as simple as grabbing a treat and putting it to the dog's nose and start manipulating that dog's body position. Right. Anytime that we use something to manipulate a dog's movement or body position, it's known as a lure. Right. So just to be fair, in other disciplines of training, we can also use leashes as a way of manipulating the dog's body, right? So there's a whole aspect of leash pressure work that can be done in a shaping process where we can teach dogs to sit, lay down, move with the leash, come to our heels, come to us, lean, we can manipulate their body postures and their body direction simply by using a leash as well as food, right?
Yeah.
So go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, sorry. I was just going to dive into chasing and the difference between luring and chasing.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because I want to be clear, and I like to use an example of Brent when we talk about luring, because for people who are listening, luring is when you keep a treat in your hand and it's in such a way that, let's say, it's in your palm but underneath your thumb, so that even if the dog's mouth is touching, it's that close that it can like lick the food. It can't have it until you release it by moving your thumb out of the way. So one
Hmm.
thing that I see people get wrong often with this kind of thing is they move the food far away from the dog. And sometimes the difference between having the food like touching the dog's nose versus a few inches away can be just enough to get the dog to kind of disengage and they don't care. Sometimes you'll get the odd dog who is like food driven and they like treats and they will take treats, but they're not quite food driven enough to do something they really don't want to do, like lay down.
Right.
So instead, they'll just watch you put it to the ground, go away,
Right.
and then they'll come back when you're going to offer it for nothing. So just to give an idea of what luring is, keeping the food near the dog in order to really closely kind of dictate where they go. Now,
Hmm.
chasing, that's when you very purposely, very strategically pull the dog, or excuse me, pull the food away from the dog very suddenly on purpose in order to build drive in the dog. An example of
Yeah.
this, luring and chasing, would be if I had a brand new puppy and I wanted to teach them how to sit, and then I also wanted to teach them the importance of a good release, like break or okay, yes, whatever the word may be. I would lure the dog into position by holding food right in front of their face. Then I would slowly guide my hand up so that the dog kind of falls into the sit position. Now, when they do, I'm going to release, break, and then I'm going to yank the food away so the dog naturally wants to get up and chase it because it's running away.
Hmm.
That's chasing.
Hmm. Hmm. There's something satisfying for dogs who either have high predatory drive or a very high food drive. There is something more satisfying about chasing and getting your food versus the food just being handed to you, right?
Right, right.
And it's something that it's a phenomenon we see in a lot of dogs. If we can get them to tap into some type of prey instinct, hunting instinct when during the act of rewarding, it just magnifies that reward event like so much more, right? So that's a really good tip. I think I love food chase games, playing with puppies and when we're really really young. Also, what I start saying is food chase games really help develop your hands as targets. So it
Right.
really makes the whole shaping process really, really easy. If I drop my hand down to my side, my dog will automatically come and run to my hand,
Hmm.
right? There are some disciplines in training where people will actually just teach a touch command, right? They'll say, touch my hand, right? Click, give the dog a treat. There was actually a dog I trained. He sucked at coming, according to the parents, but he was really good at a touch command. So we actually had to convert his touch command to a come and a long recall at a very long distance. So it was pretty cool. So that's one way we do it. Other ways that we could shape behaviors, something called free shaping or capturing a behavior, right? So capturing a behavior, free shaping, is you are either capturing something that the dog already naturally might do, or that might do on accident, right? So like an example of that is, let's say the dog is going to go pee on the grass because he just ate breakfast. Well, you're going to take him over to the grass and you're going to say, you know he's about to pee, so you say, go potty. right? And when he goes potty, guess what? 2 seconds later, he goes potty. You can click, mark that, treat him. And little by little, you're going to start associating the term go potty with the dog going to the bathroom. And it starts becoming a cue. Right. Another way of shaping something is we can actually let the dog just kind of do things by accident, and we're going to just reward and mark the moments where the dog gets it close approximations to what we want. Right. So whether we're teaching the dog to put his feet on a foot target, or teaching our dog to go to a bed, for example, anything that the dog does in the right direction of our end goal can get marked, and we can start free shaping that way with some close approximations.
Right,
Yeah.
and that kind of stuff is fun to see, especially like in high level obedience, teaching like a competition heel, crazy things like that, or even
Mhm.
like we talk about the fun little stuff like teaching a dog to roll over and stuff like. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely it's an interesting one. I remember doing Sunday Fun Days in LA. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it gives you a lot of leaves you a lot of dogs to practice with for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Another aspect of phase one work that I've always considered to be very important is when you tell that story about your mom teaching you how to wash dishes, and she's teaching you, she's shaping the different behaviors. How do I scrub a dish? How do I rinse? How do I dry? How do I put it away?
Mhm.
The things that I really focus on when talking about phase one stuff is the stuff that people tend to miss, because that sequence, your mom actively going through to teach and shape these behaviors in you,
Mhm.
is 100% correct.
Right.
And the only reason I don't harp on that aspect more is because most people already get that. So
Yeah.
I try to like kind of fill in the blanks of where people struggle. And
Mhm.
so what I try to teach people is, in doing that, your mom did more than just teach you how to wash dishes. She
Mhm.
taught you to enjoy to wash dishes. She taught you to have a drive to do it. She taught you to to kind of build, because doing it of course requires understandings. Dishes are fragile. Dishes are like many things. So you there's an overall
You
touch.
learn control. Yeah, you learn
Exactly.
control, placement, timing. You learn things
Right.
like that.
Which may
Uh-huh.
sound funny, to an adult listening to this, but as a kid, that's hard to do. And
Mhm.
from a dog's perspective, because dogs are much like kids, it's important work to teach a dog how to be gentle, how to dial it back, how to turn it up when it's important, stuff like that. So one of my biggest, most important, points that I stick to when talking about phase one stuff and shaping behaviors is you're building drive all the while. You're developing
Mhm.
all these understandings all the while. And what I tell people a lot is, when I give homework, we'll do our first lesson. Let's say if we're doing like private lesson packages with a puppy or something,
Mhm.
we'll do our lesson. I write them out their homework and I send it to them in a document. And I always leave a little side note. Just pay attention. Tomorrow, when you do your food work, you bring out your treat pouch, you start running your dog through their paces, and they're excited to do the work. Dogs like treats.
Mhm.
But notice that versus 3 or 4 days from then, when the dog sees the treat pouch and is immediately just on, ready to
Alert.
go.
Ready to work. Yeah.
Right, because you're building an association of, not only is food coming, they already know they like food, but it's like, oh, I know how to do this, great, and you can see work ethic
Mhm.
develop into a dog, and it's awesome.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's great. Well, you give them you develop anticipation for that work, and
Right,
that's really awesome. Yeah, that's the whole goal, right? Getting them excited about learning, right? And that's what makes the dog training game fun. If you have a dog who's not really excited about learning, you're probably doing something wrong in phase one.
yeah, yep, agreed.
Okay. Cool. So let's go ahead and go into. Oh, actually, you know what? There's something that we haven't talked about that's actually interesting.
Okay,
It is also possible to shape behavior without tools. Funny enough, like I remember, we could actually use spatial pressure, right? Spatial pressure. You can shape behaviors. You can get dogs to come to you, move away from you, back off of something. You don't necessarily need to use food sometimes, or leashes. You can actually manipulate dog's body just by, you can manipulate personal space by using your personal space sometimes. And it's a really interesting concept, but we can talk about that a little bit more later. Okay,
yeah, no problem. Go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, let's just jump into phase two. So, our general phase two is called the conditioning process, right? I also like to call the conditioning process the coaching process, simply because, my relationships with sports and my relationship with coaches is, in phase two, we're really looking to strengthen and develop endurance in any type of work that we're developing. right?
Mm.
There's even going to be some form of fine tuning of shaping, if you will, right? So kind of the way a coach might critique a player's technique or how he shoots the ball or how he plays offense or defense. It's the coach's job to really fine tune certain skills, to be able so that person is not conditioning the wrong version of that skill, right? There's one of my favorite sayings is that practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. And so it's really important for when you practice that you do practice proper technique, so that way you don't practice something that you're going to have to undo later, right?
Right.
So that's our phase two. Let's go ahead and go into just a couple examples of that.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So moving into phase two, but this is going to be important in any aspect of any sort of dog training. Marking is hugely important. Making sure that your markers are extremely clear and your reinforcers are on time and that they make sense to the dog so that they can 100% correlate what's happening, whether you're rewarding for something or maybe correcting for something, that they completely understand the context of what's going on so that they can start adjusting their behaviors accordingly. Now,
Mm-hmm.
with that being said, a big part of phase two, as I see it, is teaching a dog to convert over from luring and chasing, with food lures to work with leash or e-collar pressure or whatever sort of tool the dog is going to be working on long term. I mean, we've talked about this before. I mean, with the deeper look series, we've looked into corrections and pure positive and all these different things, but I think we've talked plenty enough about how important food work is.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, maybe not all the time, but a lot of the times, food just does have its limitations in terms of my dog does great with food, but when we're outside and she sees a bunny, it's a no-go.
Right.
Sees a squirrel, sees a bike. So I like to move clients over to things that are a little more reliable under distraction. So we're talking maybe a training collar, maybe an e-collar. Now, a funny thing about conditioning a dog is when I've shaped behaviors, let's say I've got a dog in a board and train and they're a week in. I've already shaped their behaviors. Dog already knows how to sit. When I start doing sits with leash pressure, the funny thing that happens is the dog looks worse that first lesson than they did a couple lessons ago when I was doing it with food. And it seems as if they've taken a step backwards. So the reason why that is because now the dog is given an extra piece of the puzzle to have to think about. It's like driving
Right.
a manual car. They know how to sit down, but now there's leash pressure, and that's taking up a lot of their mental capacity because they're like, "What is this thing that's kind of telling me where to go?"
Right.
So you're shaping a dog's understandings of the leash. They already know how to sit. You're kind of working to overcome their like natural oppositional response so that they learn how to yield, kind of like with the horse. You
Mm-hmm.
just want them to follow the leash and go where it takes them. And I think that that's a very important skill set to
Mm-hmm.
learn in phase two.
And also, I think another benefit of doing any type of pressure work, and again, micro doses of pressure is what it is. We're trying to actually teach dogs how to tolerate micro doses of stress, right? So that they can learn to problem solve, reason, and learn to tolerate other forms of stress that might come environmentally, right? Like, if I have a dog who's like a severe leash puller, if I don't teach that dog to yield to leash pressure, well, guess what? He's going to choke himself out,
Hmm.
right? Especially if he's a very impulsive or reactive dog, squirrels, other dogs, whatever he's reactive to. If he does not become sensitive to being at the end of his leash, then we're going to have a problem later on with focus, with engagement, with his neck, right? His trachea, right? So we got to really make sure that we isolate teaching dogs any form of yielding to pressure, because even though it may not be immediately in use during the shaping stage, we're definitely going to start using it when we start introducing high level or higher level distractions,
Hmm.
right? And so if our dogs don't know how to turn off pressure or how to yield to something, then they tend to fall victims to their instincts and their impulses at those times, right? And so yeah, so that's we work on controlling that oppositional response, as you said, and teaching them to cooperate with maybe other forms of feedback from us.
Yeah, definitely. I think that Shona, who we had on last week, said it perfectly that you teach your dog that they are in control of the pressure. They know how to turn off the pressure, and they do that by completing the task that you ask of them. And that's exactly why you start with shaping. Because the thing about pressure is when you're working leash pressure or e-collar pressure with the dog, a funny thing will happen when you're going through that lesson. You'll notice that the first time you start applying leash or e-collar pressure, and we're talking minute pressure, just to echo Brent's point here, we are not talking corrections. We're
Mhm.
not there yet.
Right.
Low level working pressure with whatever the tool is. Even so, the dog will look a little confused, will look a little worse in terms of like maybe slower commands than they did a couple lessons ago when you were doing food. And it's not that they fell backwards per se, it's now that you're applying leash pressure or e-collar pressure, you're throwing another ball in the air that they now have to continue to juggle along with just doing obedience. So with
Mhm.
that being understood by a trainer, it's our job then to be patient. It's almost like shifting gears, and you allow for that little dip as you slowly start picking the dog back up to where they were before. Only this time we're using less food. I want to be clear, it's still a very good idea to reward with food. I just stop luring with food at a certain point. So I'm no longer using food
Right.
in the dog's face to coax them to sit. Now I'm using leash or e-collar pressure. And what Brent was alluding to earlier when he was talking about the things that you learn alongside the actual stuff, coaching. A thing about coaching is there's a lot of good reasons why it's good for kids and adults to play sports because the technical skill required to play a sport is one thing. It's real. You learn, you get better at shooting a basketball, hitting a baseball, whatever the case may be. But there's so many lessons that really help round you out that come
Mhm.
along with it. Like, in order to be really good at shooting a jump shot, it requires practice, and practice requires what? Devotion, time management, focus, and all these different things.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's where conditioning is super important. That's where leash work really teaches a dog how to deal with minute amounts of pressure. And I want to hear you talk a little bit about how we kind of microdose the dog with pressure so that they can understand to pick it up and run with it on their own.
Yeah, so microdoses of pressure. So it's very normal. So the oppositional response that most dogs have, for those of you listening who don't know what it is, oppositional response is anytime we are forced to do something, be it held back or someone grabs us or pulls us in a direction. Our natural response is to literally pull in the opposing direction, right? Hence the phrase oppositional response. And so what happens is, this is the biggest reason why dogs don't have slack on their leash, right? They're pulling forward, their owners pull back. They
Mm.
create like a big tight leash in between the two of them. And so it ends up kind of becoming a game of tug of war between you and the dog's neck, right? And so oppositional response is really important to interrupt and sometimes even counter condition. So that way the dog learns that the leash in and of itself is a communication tool, right? So common ways that we would do this in like leash pressure work. I consider leash pressure work being part of my shaping process personally, because I know at some point I'm going to need it a little bit later. But in it's definitely a must to have when we're starting to do the conditioning process, because the point of the conditioning process is to create strength and endurance of a behavior.
Mhm.
Right. So you're going to see lots of repetition. You're going to see little bits of distraction come in. We'll talk about that more in detail. But so without the ability to physically prompt the dog or guide the dog, then it becomes really hard. Then we run the risk of actually potentially having more failures with certain types of dogs, certain personalities, right? So definitely having that. Now, what it does psychologically for the dog, it forces the dog to think, um, if I am stressed, be it even a little bit, what is it do I have to that I have to do to make this stress go away? Okay. And so this is something interesting that's really important, just kind of like teaching an athlete to think on their toes, or to think on their feet when things are not picture perfect. What is it how do you problem solve? How can you become resourceful? How can you think, to get rid of whatever stress that is coming your way, right? How can you problem solve? And so microdosing dogs on little bits of stress is really helpful for the overall teaching dogs how to learn process, because I think that definitely won't. I see dogs who aren't taught to deal with stress at a young age. We start seeing they tend to be slightly handicapped in certain areas down the line, right? When it comes to dealing with stress in general, right? So yeah, that would be my stance on it, and that's why we do leash work.
Yeah, 100%. In fact, talking about a dog not learning how to deal with stress at a young age, I just met with a new client this afternoon, and their dog, who not their fault, it was it's a foster that they got like a couple months ago, and the dog overall is like 2 years old. But the
Mhm.
dog has no idea how to deal with any kind of pressure. The dog is one of those that is like deathly afraid of just going outside,
Mm.
scared of every little thing. And I was explaining to the owners largely the same thing. So the purpose of phase one stuff is shaping, which they understood. Purpose of phase two stuff was, teaching the to avoid oppositional response on the leash, teaching to roll with the leash, teaching to not let the leash become its own distraction in and of itself.
Mhm.
And just kind of be a part of the whole process that the dog can still roll with. It's kind of like you would talk about, like you shoot your jumpers in the shaping phase. You're taught your form, you give the ball, give it a ball, give it a ball, and you just keep going with no distractions in a perfectly quiet gym.
Mhm.
Then you put a defender in someone's face, and nothing is really different. They're not like they're in the way, but you can still shoot the ball completely uninhibited. And
Yep.
yet your percentage goes down because
Right.
mentally speaking, there's something to that distraction that makes it harder for you, even though in reality it doesn't. It does, and it's that fun kind of push and pull. So, you know,
What's the dynamics? I mean, even like, I like to, you guys that may not know, but Mariano is actually a very talented and decorated boxer. And think of it like you can punch a punching bag all the time for as many times as you want and to hit all these combinations, but it's different when it's punching back.
it's different when there's an opponent in your face. And you know what's funny too? It's different. It's Thank you, by the way. I wasn't going to bring that
Yeah.
up. I wasn't trying to
Yeah. No
humble
problem.
brag. Jujitsu too, but we'll talk about that another day. Um,
Now you're bragging. You dick.
okay. But yes, it's a good point, and it's the same point, right? Hitting a bag. We were just doing this today. Shout out to my trainer Victor at it's first class underscore fitness. Um, yes, it's very different. Punching a heavy bag, which it moves, it doesn't hit back, but it moves around, versus sparring with someone are not the same thing. And even sparring with someone versus an actual match in front of judges that will matter for your record, that all these things, even though it's technically the same as sparring, it's just not the same.
Right.
One can't really account for the pressure that you put on yourself when you look at your opponent. And vice versa. They're doing the same thing, and you can see it in them. And it's just such a crazy dynamic that there's really no way to train for these big moments. So you have to get into the big moments and do it in time, but that's not before you're ready. That's where shaping low level stuff really plays a part, because I'll tell you what, man, like my first few matches in high stakes stuff like Oxnard or Golden Glove stuff like that, like you don't even really think. Yeah, you're too nervous. Like
Mm.
you just look at the guy, and in your head you're like, this guy's huge. There's no fucking way he's like 100, but then a few rounds in you're like, oh, okay, yeah, he looks like my size. Okay, I see it now. But your brain plays funny games with you, so you're not even really aware of what's going on. So
Right.
I think that that's a nice segue into phase three, which is finishing work. And
Right.
what we consider finishing work is we consider it to be conditioning training, but for real world applications. So definitely we do lots of drilling in phase two. Just sit down, sit down, sit down, and really
Mhm.
make sure that we hammer it home so that it's second nature, even when the dog is under distraction. But
Right.
conditioning for the real world, much like competition versus training, is
Mhm.
not always the same. So I wanted to hear your take on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I guess a great distinction, if we're going to kind of stick to sports or athletics, it's practicing. In phase two, our goal is to condition so that eventually we can practice full out, right? So scrimmaging, it's a form of practicing full out. But in phase three, we're actually teaching them, getting them ready for the game, right? We're getting them ready for the actual event, right? Whatever the event is, whether the event is just going to the restaurant down the street and laying down while the waiters bring food, or whether the main event is teaching your dog to stay on a bed while 4 or 5 guests come over for dinner, right? Whatever the main event is, we have to condition a lot so that the tools are strong enough to be able to be used in real life applications. But then the actual phase three itself, what we're doing is we're actually putting the dog in that circumstance and fine tuning and finishing the process so that the dog goes from learning a command to now learning a new behavior, right?
Right.
Um, and that's the end goal of phase
Right.
three.
And learning a new behavior in a particular environment of high distraction so that we know without a doubt the dog can perform, not in theory, but in reality, under said distraction.
It's that the dog's going to be reliable in real life.
Correct, exactly, and that changes. So I wanted to bring up because I know that just before we started rolling here, Brent and I were talking about really making sure that we take care to delineate the difference between your average pet, obedience training dog and like high level sports stuff, which Brent's dog, if you haven't seen Dynamite, you have to look Brent up on YouTube and different things. Dynamite is dope. His Doberman is really sharp with his commands that are above and beyond what you might ask of a dog just for normal obedience sake. So I just wanted to hear you riff a little bit on the differences in like high level conditioning, how finishing work can be different, and maybe how we can even add phases to a dog when we're talking different, like schutzen or sport work
Mhm,
or
mhm, mhm,
frisbee.
mhm, mhm. Um, so yeah, so when it comes to finishing work, we're trying to develop focus around high level distraction, self control around high level distraction, and also problem solving skills around high level distraction. Right. I think that's really really important, especially when we're doing if we're doing any form of service or sport work, right? Whether it's a service dog, a therapy dog, a search and rescue dog, like we want the dog to be able to hone in completely on whatever they've been taught to do, and be able to tune certain things out, right? And that is usually done with lots of reinforcement. There might be some natural reinforcers in the training process, right? So, like, if I have a beagle who I'm doing scent work with, well, the act of going to smell something might be a natural reinforcer, right? So, that's something that we want to look at. But I guess, sorry, what was the question again? I got a little off
Well,
topic.
that's okay. So what I wanted to clarify and what I wanted to hear you riff on rather was
Mhm.
we're talking about three phases of dog training, but when we get into the more advanced stuff, how can that vary? How can that differ? I just want to make sure.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of prep work sometimes when we're going into the higher level, sports stuff. You might have to do some. You might have to start certain skills in parallel with obedience and shaping other things, right? So, like, if I was going to teach a dog, let's say a retrieve, right? Well, I would develop that in the same process, right? I would still do shaping, then I do conditioning, then I do close approximations. Getting the dog to bring it 3 feet and hold, teaching the dog to not drop his dumbbell, right? So there would be little tiny steps that we would take. So finishing work, we may be doing 3 or 4 modules in training in parallel with each other, right? So you might be doing an obedience module, you might be doing a healing module, separately. We might be doing, off leash recall module. Like you might be working on several different modules in parallel if you are going to be doing some types of sport dog work.
Right.
Right.
Here's an interesting one too, because we were talking about when it comes to like the average obedience dog, conditioning for real world application typically means taking distractions and stuff and turning them up. Right. We
Mhm.
take our dogs to Starbucks, take our dogs to a restaurant, walking around a park, stuff like that, versus an empty training room.
Right.
Now, here's a fun one. In certain types of protective work, of course, in like high level shoots in sport, you want the dog to be able to perform under distraction because when the handler is, the dog is on the bite and the handler's swinging the dog and yelling at the dog and swinging his little whip around, he's trying to pressure the dog to see how the dog performs under pressure. But here's a funny little dichotomy. I've seen a lot of work done for dogs they're working dogs in that same sort of work, but they're more for security or like, police units or, and so the funny thing is they're actually taught kind of in reverse. They start with the guy being a very clear agitator. He walks in kind of weird and kind of skulky. And so the dog's natural response is, who's that guy? Brr, brr, brr. Not to mention, he looks giant because of the bite suit. So the dog already has an easy time identifying the target, so to speak. Right now,
Mhm.
as the dog gets better, it's the agitator's job to turn it down. Because
Mhm.
how do you get a dog so sharp that you give them their command, revere or whatever the case, and then the dog, bark, 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 even if the person isn't quite looking like such a clear threat, right?
Mhm.
So we would have to really condition the dog. We go from the bite suit to the sleeve to a smaller sleeve, so the dog doesn't just associate with the bite sleeve, or and then it
Mhm.
goes like I'm agitating, walking toward the dog with the stick, looking real menacing. Then I'm just kind of standing in the room. Then I'm sitting on a chair, and the dog still has to engage
Mhm.
reliably and with fervor and conviction. When a guy's sitting there,
Mhm.
sometimes the dog is like, bark. But they need to be like, oh, that guy, okay, burr, burr, burr. And it's very interesting to see conditioning happen in reverse, but it's such an interesting process, and it's largely the same.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's the key. I mean, that's it's interesting how when you're developing different skills in the so pretty much we're trying to phase into more reality is what
Right,
is what it is, right? So little by little, it's like how do we make things more realistic for the dog,
right,
right? And don't get them to be reliant on the setup, right? So like you see that all the time. It's like even something as simple as like hiding your treat pouch makes things more realistic for the dog, right? Because if they see the treat pouch on your waist, well, they probably know it's training time, right? Or if we ask things, randomize things, and ask them in real time, right, in real circumstances, how do we kind of blur? How do we make it not seem like a movie set? You
right,
know,
exactly,
you know,
right.
and how do we get the dog to think like, oh, at any time, it's I need to know my lines, right? For lack of a better analogy.
I
Uh,
really liked when you made it a point to bring up, you do it all the time, but I think the last time we heard it on the podcast was when we were talking our COVID episode and how you can condition your dogs at home because everybody's stuck at home.
mhm.
And for whatever reason, everybody snatched up like a bajillion dogs, which is awesome. Um,
Yeah,
so what you were talking about that I really liked was recall your dog just whenever. It doesn't have to be like a structured lesson. Just hey, you come, good, and just do it here and there in order to keep your dog on their toes because work can happen at any time. I think that that's an important lesson for a dog to know. 100%.
yeah, no, that's the key. That's randomization is really nice.
Right.
All right, let's move on to the next point. So when do we progress through different modes of training? Right? Are there specific tips or checkpoints that you like to have before you move forward?
Yes. The funny thing is I have a lot of tips and I have a lot of things that I look out for. Um, the weird thing is I don't think I've ever actually had to verbalize them that much. So let's see what we can do here. So
Yeah,
when I move a dog forward in training, and as I talk about this, I'm thinking of our assistants that we had in LA.
right.
Um, if a dog displays very clear understanding of of what's currently expected of them, then I know it's time to turn things up, and that's because as important as it is to avoid moving too fast and overwhelming the dog, I don't want to lose motivation in training by making things go stale. When
Mhm.
we're talking about board and train dogs, we would really only have like between 3 and maybe 8 weeks at the top end, which is sounds like a lot of time, but not when you're considering a dog may have had a certain habit for like 8 years.
Right.
So we really have to take advantage of every little piece of motivation, every little piece of leverage that we as trainers have and that we can create that isn't necessarily there on its own. So,
Hmm.
an example. I was working place with my board and train puppy that goes home in exactly 6 days.
Right.
Now, she's in phase three. We're finishing work. We're doing real life stuff. So, her dad is a physical therapist, and he was asking me, will she be viable to take to the clinic? And so I said, okay, well, I'm glad you asked. So, listen, what we're going to do is start kind of tailoring phase three a little bit to work that is conducive to a dog in a workspace. So now we're talking really long duration, high distraction place command stuff. Now, what I would do, I'd put her in place by the front door, behind my back, knock, knock, knock on the wall or the door, something like that. And she'd, oh, ruff, 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 and she'd get up and she'd, want to come to the door. So at that point, I'd know, mark it, correct it, put her back in place. Good, mark that. And then do it again, do it again, do it again. And after a couple lessons of that, she was solid. I'd knock on the door, she wouldn't even flinch. She was like, "Pff,"
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know, she'd look at me like I was an idiot, like I know what you're doing. And so at that
She's like, I know this setup. Huh.
she would look at me like, no. So okay, so I'm like, okay, fine, it's time to turn it up. I know that they have a Ring doorbell just through like conversation. I look on my phone, YouTube, Ring doorbell sound, dung dung dung, and all of a sudden she flips again, and I'm like, aha, so when I see that she's really confident and consistent with her high level of like expectation, and she's not messing up with the door knock, then I move on. And then when she gets confident with that, I'm going to move on again. And that's what I look for. Does the dog seem clear and confident and not at all confused or shut down or overwhelmed? That's when I
Right.
know it's time to push things forward.
Right. I think there's a common mistake that people think that the dog has to be perfect in a phase before moving on to the next ones. And I guess let me define what perfect is. So
Mhm.
perfect, I guess the right time to move forward in something is just if you see fluency in something, right? Because it's so funny because we can actually jump into the next phase of training let's say we've worked on something 2 or 3 times, 2 or 3 sessions working on something, and we see on that third round the dog now is really fluid. I'm hitting 6, 7 repetitions in a row of a certain concept, 10 repetitions in a row, and sometimes that's something that you build up, right? So sometimes dog trainers who aren't experienced kind of pushing a little bit. And when I say pushing, just sometimes trying something on, right?
Mhm.
Let's say my dog is sitting perfectly for food, sitting perfectly for food, where he can anticipate if I say the word sit, he sits perfectly. Well, I can simply throw a slip lead on that dog right away, and I can actually put some pressure up on his neck for 2 seconds and say sit, and he sits really, really quick. He gets the cookie just the same,
Mhm.
right? But because his conditioning for sit was done so well that he doesn't the leash pressure doesn't phase him as much, right?
Mhm.
Because he was that focused. And then very quickly within 2, 3 sessions, I can develop food work and leash lures, right? And so you can do things like that. There are sometimes you might be able to push the dog on a certain concept like a down, but he's not ready for a sit stay yet, right? So you're going to kind of see every command or every concept kind of lives on its own grading scale. But definitely, if you see that the dog is having a clear understanding or fluency or able to be repetitious, sometimes just slipping in the next phase of that learning, it works, right? The dog will actually take it pretty quickly, and then now that becomes your new starting point where you left off the last time. So it takes a little bit of experience practicing that, to know when you can try move on to that next stage, but it's pretty easy when you get the hang of it.
That's an excellent point because you're totally right that each command does kind of have its own grading scale. Like downs tend to be harder for dogs than sits on average.
Of
And
course.
it's funny, whenever I have a dog that's struggling with down, I work place because the bed is comfy, so the dog just lays down, and I just
Mhm.
mark it. So we were talking about capturing behaviors, then I'll go backwards and do it that way. And then
Mhm.
once they have it in place, then I'll work downs without the placemat. And so definitely, it is fun when you get more competent with dog training, and that's the kind of thing that experience will teach you. It's hard to like even if someone just kind of sat there and explained it to you because they've done it to us throughout the years, doing it is a different thing,
Yeah.
and it's largely about feel. But yeah, definitely when the dog seems confident, when you have these fun little tricks up your sleeve of how to kind of maybe play with the phases a little bit, like Brent was just talking about, or I was just talking about with the down versus place kind of thing, and you can tidy things up on the back end, it's a very, very powerful and potent tool that a trainer should have.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep. And it takes experience. It takes experience, but it also takes what's it called? Like it has to be shown to you, because
Peanut
there are
butter.
some the peanut butter. Yeah, it's called peanut butter. There are some things that we don't know are possible as dog trainers unless we see it presented to us before, right?
Right.
So if you don't have mentors, if you're not watching other dog trainers, if you're not trying to take knowledge from them, then you're not going to know a technique or a transition from one type of a phase to a different type of phase is possible so seamlessly, right? And then when you see it, I mean, it's just kind of like anything. Like when you see a good basketball player, if you're a basketball player, you go, man, how does he make it look so flawless? Right. And then you know that it's possible. So you work really, really hard to get to that point.
Hmm.
Right. So it is really, really important for that to be demonstrated, or for you to witness other dog trainers who are good at their craft. So you can kind of see those, we don't want to call them shortcuts, but we can call them, a very efficient transitions.
Yeah, well, shout out to our friend Corey Chavez with Corcha Balanced Canine.
Yeah.
Uh, we had him on for episode 10, and we're looking forward to having him on again pretty soon here. He's just a busy guy, but we'll make that happen. But he he explained something really, really well, and he was talking about when I have a goal for a dog or client, I think of what that goal is, and then I reverse engineer it to break it
Hmm.
down into the realistic steps until I get down to the point to where the dog currently is. And when you're looking at a perfectly seamless, just skillful basketball, I think of like Kobe's jump shot, which is perfect,
Hmm.
on top of
Hmm.
everything else, like the, fainting, fadeaway jumper, which is like so many different mechanics happening at once that it's hard to really put it into words. But all of it seems so seamless. But a basketball player understands he's doing like 8 different things right now with
Right.
defenders on. So
Right. Right.
it was just a matter of he must have drilled each and every one of those things in and of themselves to get them down to perfection and then mix it all together and get that combination down to perfection. So it's
Right.
fun to see, but reverse engineering your ultimate goal for where you want the dog to be makes it a little more. It seems more feasible and it seems more doable, and then it kind of shows you the roadmap if you ever feel stuck.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's I really like that. I remember complimenting him so much on that phrase because I was like, yeah, you know what? That's so funny. That we do kind of do that naturally. We just don't bring attention to it.
Right.
Um, cool. So those are kind of our recommendations of when to progress. What would you say about like when to dial things back? Like how would you know maybe you're moving too fast in training?
Yeah. Are you ready for this?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Learned helplessness.
Oh, that's not
So
good.
yeah, yeah, no, it's not good. So
Moving targets.
moving
No, just
target,
joking.
yeah, moving
Joking.
target. Sorry, that got me good. Okay, when to dial it back. To me, when the dog shows signs of being confused or overwhelmed or they're failing too much. And what I mean by failing too much as opposed to failing at all is here and there when you're pushing a dog through their phases in training, sometimes you'll, or most of the time, you'll get really good reps out of them. Every now and again, you'll have to fix things, correct things, whatever the case. And I used to write it out for owners like this when I was first doing evals, like to see if they even wanted to do training with me. I would put, 10, exactly 10 little pluses and minuses, like 3 plus, 3 minus, and then 2, and then 1 or whatever. And I
Mhm.
would just ask them, like, so there's, let's say, 6 pluses and, 4 minuses. And I would say, how many valuable reps are represented here? And they would go 6. And I would go, I would say 10 because even the minuses, even when I had to correct or fix
Mhm.
certain things, those are still valuable repetitions. Teaching the dog what not to do
Yeah, yeah,
still helps teach the dog what they do need to do because
right.
dogs are efficient like anything else. They want to get the food as quickly as possible with the least amount of resistance.
Mhm.
But there's a tipping point. If the dog is failing too much, you'll see them lose motivation. You'll see them lose confidence. You'll
Mhm.
see them shut down and tune out. So I want to hear you riff on it a little bit because Brent, you guys actually taught me a lot about looking for these signs and how to dial back if ever was necessary. So definitely, man.
Yeah, I guess the first place I wanna start, I guess, with it is so it's usually always just bad reads,
Right.
bad reads on the practitioner, right? So if we are rushing, if we're impatient, if we haven't developed enough foundational stuff, if we're trying to meet a deadline for a dog or whatever the reason is that your dog seems to look confused, those are all telltale signs that you need to slow it down and back it up, right? I remember there would be certain times where we felt that dogs were behind, right? And when I was younger, a younger dog trainer, one of the things we would do is we would just kind of push them through the skill, right? The dog would do it begrudgingly, right? It's a sit stay, a down command. The dog, instead of having a nice straight down command, the dog would be like, oh, fuck, why do I have to lay down? I
Hmm.
hate
Hmm.
this command, right? And so, unfortunately, when you rush things or when you're pushing too fast or you're not paying attention to what the dog actually needs or wants, then this is a perfect time to dial it back. Now, what does dial back really mean? It can mean a number of things, but primarily you have to go back and make sure that your foundational stuff is completely understood, right? Be it a leash foundation, be it a food based foundation. Does your dog understand what the desired behaviors are, and is the dog have any motivation to complete them,
Right.
right? Versus does the dog just feel like he's getting in trouble all the time, or are we asking too much of the dog at that time, right?
Right.
So for example, if I just taught a dog to lay down and stay who loves to chase skateboards, well, if he just learned it in a session, my next session is not going to be putting him around skateboards in a downstay,
Taking him
right?
Tony Hawk's house and
Yeah, I'm not taking him to Tony Hawk's house and expecting the dog to lay down, right?
right.
So we have to condition certain skills a lot more before we kind of add more weight to it, right? Like you have to turn, what is it, like in weight training? It's
Mhm.
like a what your personal best or whatever, like where
Oh,
you
your
max
PR.
out your
Mhm.
PR, right? You have to if you can rep it, right? If you can rep what you would normally only be able to do once, well, you're
Mhm.
getting stronger, right? So we want to make sure that we can get our dogs to perform a task many times in a row, as we talked about, before we start adding more weight to it. So before we start proofing or before we start throwing a higher level of distraction on it, we want to make sure that the dog is comfortable and understanding. Pretty much, we want to see Any signs of confusion or overwhelming or failing is a sign that it might be too much or we might be rushing.
Correct. And you just brought me to a point. That was an amazing point, by the way. And it just kind of it like sparked my brain to add something to it.
Mm-hmm.
When in weight training, the reason why weights are measured is so that we can measure our progress and stay motivated.
Right.
So in dog training, it makes no difference to the dog if you were going to do exactly 10 minutes of a downstay and they got up at 9:58. They didn't know like 2 more seconds. They just know how they're feeling in the moment. So
Mm-hmm.
when we're using time in training, like, when we're writing out homework, do a downstay for 30 seconds, 2 minutes, and it's not because there's something magical about those amounts of time. It's for the owners to stay motivated so that their dog can stay motivated because of course you're your dog's coach and you're and the parent and the teacher. So giving them finite moments of time that can be calculated and are shown mathematically to be longer and longer show progress. And I just want to be clear with that because I've talked to clients so much about that kind of thing when we're transitioning out of training, like toward the tail end of things. Homework was largely linear. 5 minute downstay, 30-minute downstay, hour long place command. And then toward the tail end, I'm like, okay, guys, listen. So exactly what I just said about the weight training. It was just to gauge your own progress. Now I want you to start gauging your dog's state of mind. Put your
Mm-hmm.
dog in place. They're reactive when your roommate comes in the house. Okay, put them in place. And however long your dog is antsy in place is however long they're going to stay there. Could be 5 minutes, could be 40 minutes. As soon as
Mm-hmm.
they calm down and let it go and relax, then they can be released. Don't worry about time. Let your
Right.
dog tell you when it's time.
Right. Right. Cool, man. I love that. So just to kind of recap on some stuff. So we went over some 3 phases: shaping, conditioning, and finishing work, and what they are, when to progress from one stage of training to the next stage of training, and definitely when to dial it back. If the dog is failing or seems overwhelmed or is lacking motivation, that is always a red flag for us to make sure we take a step back.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, we want to thank you all for listening. Again, this was episode 16, Moving Through Phases of Training. Please make sure that you like, comment, or subscribe this podcast or whatever platform you're watching it on, YouTube, Facebook. Go ahead and leave us some comments because we'd really like to see what you guys have to say. If you guys have any ideas of topics that you guys would like to hear, please go ahead and send that to us. You can also find us on YouTube and all major podcast providers. You can also email us, dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com. And last but not least, guys, if you haven't already, please go ahead and follow me and Mariano on Instagram. Mariano is Untamed Dog Co. That's Untamed Dog Co. And mine is Canis Behavior, Canis Behavior, all one word. We want to thank you guys so much, and thank you guys for sharing these podcasts. We start seeing that those views and those listens and those downloads are going up every single week. So we can't thank you guys enough, whoever's spreading that word. And we just want to thank you guys again, and we will look forward to showing you guys what we got for episode 17. Again, my name is Brent Labrada, and that guy over there is Mariano Alvarez, and we will see you guys next time. Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
We'll see you next time.